Good morning.
Good morning.
The word of the Lord which came to Hosea, the son of Beeri, during the days of Hosea, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and during the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel. When the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, "Go, take to yourself a wife of harlotry, and have children of harlotry, for the land commits flagrant harlotry, forsaking the Lord." So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. The Lord said to him, "Name him Jezreel, for yet a little while, and I will punish the house of Jehu for the bloodshed of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. On that day I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel." Then she conceived again and gave birth to a daughter. And the Lord said to him, "Name her Lo-Ruhamah, for I will no longer have compassion on the house of Israel, that I would ever forgive them. But I will have compassion on the house of Judah, and deliver them by the Lord their God, and will not deliver them by bow, sword, battle, horses, or horsemen." When she had weaned Lo-Ruhamah, she conceived and gave birth to a son, and the Lord said, "Name him Lo-Ammi, for you are not my people, and I am not your God." Hosea 1, verses 1 through 9. Now, the book of Hosea is one of those books that's notoriously difficult for people to make outlines out of, and you can pick up any preacher's outline or any commentator's outline of Hosea, and I guarantee you that it's going to be different from anybody else's. But one fact that's generally agreed on is that the first 3 chapters of Hosea all go together, and that they all talk about this relationship that Hosea has with his wife Gomer. And I'm particularly convinced of this, and the Bible draws this point here, that the literal marriage of Hosea and Gomer, which bookends verses 1 through 9 of chapter 1 and verses 3 through 5 of chapter 3, that is the entirety of chapter 3, that literal marriage is intended to be a reflection of God's relationship with Israel. And so in chapter 1 and verse 10 through 2 verse 1, we have a description of God and Israel and their spiritual children of harlotry being restored. In chapter 2 and verses 14 through 23, we have the same image, God and Israel and the spiritual harlot herself being restored. And in the middle of it is a present situation of judgment in 2 verses 2 through 13. And we're going to look at this a little bit more in detail as we go throughout this morning. But the picture that God paints is simultaneously Israel's present prostitution to the idols and Israel's possible future hope at being restored to God. This is a tension that is all throughout the prophets. God will show Israel and say, "This is what you could be. This is what you have a chance of becoming." And then turn around and say, "But this is what you are. You are not my people. You do not have compassion. You have defiled yourself before me," God says. A tension between the ideal Israel that is full of hope and righteousness and glory, and the actual Israel that is full of sin and rebellion and judgment. The question is begged by this tension, and this is something you will find throughout all of the prophets, and not just through Hosea. But the question is begged, how can this Israel become that Israel? How can the Israel in her sin become Israel in the righteousness of God? But Hosea starts out with this image of a prophet being asked to do what is probably one of the most difficult things a prophet has ever been asked to do. He is told to go and to marry a woman who is going to cheat on him and commit adultery on him. He is told to marry a woman who is a harlot, a prostitute. And we don't have a lot of information about Hosea as a person outside of the book that bears his name, and we know even less about his father, Beeri. But what we do know is what the text tells us. The time that he came about in the reigns of Hosea and Jotham and Ahaz and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and Jeroboam, king of Israel, and why it only lists one king of Israel when there were so many others they could have pointed to that were contemporaneous, I do not know. As far as Hosea is concerned, Jeroboam is the end for Israel. The house of Jehu was broken after that point. But God speaks to Hosea and he commands him to do two things that are really difficult. He commands him to marry a prostitute, something that would have been forbidden of the priests in the law, Leviticus 21 and verse 7 and verse 14. And then he is told to go and have children of harlotry, children of prostitution. And the reason, he says, is because the land is committing flagrant harlotry against the Lord. God intends for Hosea's marriage to mirror his marriage to Israel. Now, whether Gomer was already a prostitute or whether she became one later on in the marriage, I do not know the answer to that question. It would probably mirror God's experience with Israel if she was already one, because Israel themselves have been defying God since before the beginning. In Joshua 24, we learn that Israel served other gods even before they were Israel. Even when Abraham and Terah were living in the land of Haran, they served other gods, Joshua 24 says. And even in the land of Egypt, Israel served other gods. And even in the wilderness, they brought along the tabernacles of their gods, and they worshipped them, and the star gods, and so on. Israel has been committing harlotry since the beginning. This idea of harlotry or prostitution is a term that's used throughout the Old Testament to describe literal prostitution, yes, but also to describe idolatry. For example, one can think of the passage in Numbers chapter 25 and verse 1, wherever after Balaam has failed to curse the people of Israel, he has only managed to bless them, he incites the Moabites and the Midianites to intermarry with Israel. And it says in chapter 25 of Numbers in verse 1 that while Israel remained at Shittim, the people began to play the harlot with the daughters of Moab. Now, whether they were committing prostitution or whether that's a reference to idolatry, people argue about that. I tend to think it's both. Because because they usually go hand in hand with each other, don't they? Once we allow any kind of sin to become okay and acceptable, well, the door has been opened for any kind of abominations whatsoever. It's like Paul says in Romans chapter 1, after they've worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, and they've so debased themselves to worship other gods, their behavior begins to mirror that of the gods they are worshiping. And so they give their bodies up to sick pleasures, and Romans 1 talks about a whole host of sins, lusting after all sorts of things, because they follow the gods. If there's a principle that is taught in the Bible, it is that people become what they worship. Psalm 115 talks about this. You know how the idols, they have eyes but they can't see. They have ears but they can't hear. They have a mouth that can't speak. They have a nose that can't smell, and all these different things. And at the end it says that the person who worships these lifeless gods will in time become the same thing. You become what you worship. And so harlotry, when Israel commits this spiritual harlotry, it's not surprising to see it go hand in hand with literal harlotry. In fact, this is the language of the prophets all over the place. For those who want to say, keep the Bible on a G-rated level of no, where we talk nice about everything and everything's all hunky-dory and there's all about rainbows and puppies and flowers. I hate to break it to you, but that's not the way the Bible usually presents things. Read Ezekiel sometime and you'll see that. Ezekiel chapter 16 is perhaps the most graphic and disturbing depiction of Israel's spiritual adultery, spiritual prostitution, the way she's behaved herself. And if you read Ezekiel 16 in English, you're actually getting a toned-down version of what it's like in Hebrew. So we're not going to read it because it's a very lengthy chapter. But I'll read a couple of other passages for you to kind of get this idea in your head. In Jeremiah chapter 3, for instance, in Jeremiah chapter 3, God asks the question. He says, if a husband divorces his wife and she goes from him and belongs to another man, will he still return to her? Will not that land be completely polluted? But you are a harlot with many lovers, yet you return to me, declares the Lord. Lift up your eyes to the bare heights and see. Where have you not been violated? By the roads you have sat down for them, like an Arab in the desert. And you have polluted a land with your harlotry and with your wickedness. Therefore the showers have been withheld, and there has been no spring rain. Yet you had a harlot's forehead, you refused to be ashamed. Have you not just now called to me? My father, you are the friend of my youth. Will he be angry forever? Will he be indignant to the end? Behold, you have spoken and done evil things, and you have had your way. And then the Lord said to me in the days of Josiah the king, have you seen what faithless Israel did? She went up on every high hill and under every green tree, and she was a harlot there. I thought after she's done all these things, she will return to me. But she did not return. And her treacherous sister Judah saw it. And I saw that for all the adulteries of faithless Israel, I had sent her away and given her a writ of divorce. Yet her treacherous sister Judah did not fear, but she went and was a harlot also. Because of the lightness of her harlotry, she polluted the land and committed adultery with stones and trees. Yet in spite of all this, her treacherous sister Judah did not return to me with all her heart, but rather in deception, declares the Lord. And the Lord said to me, faithless Israel has proved herself more righteous than treacherous Judah. Now, there almost appears to be a throwback to what Hosea was saying here. Because Hosea was preaching to Israel, the 10 tribes of the house of Israel. And throughout Hosea, you'll see this sprinkled throughout, these little warnings to Judah. Don't be like Israel, Judah. And some people have suggested that maybe Hosea wrote down all his words after the fact, and he takes the message to Judah and preaches it to them. It's like, take a look at what happened. I told this to Israel. It happened ahead of time, and look what happened to them, he says. Well, and I don't know if that's right. That's just one reconstruction that's out there. But, besides the point, Israel knew Judah knew what happened to Israel. They knew the abominations of her sister. They knew the adultery that she committed with the idols, with the rocks and the stones and the trees. And they did the same thing. And they are called even more guilty for it. Faithless Israel has proven herself more righteous than treacherous Judah. And how much more for us? We who see the history, who can look back and see what happened to those who betrayed God, who cheated on Him, who committed adultery on Him. How we could look back and we are even with less excuse than they are. There's more to it than that, though. There's children involved. And again, whether all of the children are Hosea, or whether Hosea is not the legitimate father of some of these children, I do not know. People speculate on end about that. But what I do know is that the names of the children mean something. God specifically instructs Hosea to name his children these different ways. This is, by the way, this is not something unique that God does with the prophets. Marriages is not something unique that God dictates to the prophet. Jeremiah was told not to marry. Ezekiel, his wife died, and Ezekiel was told not to mourn for her in Ezekiel 24. Could you do that? It's a rough one. In the same way, God would frequently use children for signs. The prophet Isaiah had 4 such children mentioned throughout his text. She'er Jashub and Emmanuel and Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz and so on. And what happened, Isaiah names his children these things, and they symbolize different things in Isaiah 7, 8, and 9. At some point, we're going to start a study on Isaiah on Thursday night, if I ever get around to it, and then maybe we'll talk about that some more. But this is not unique among the prophets, although Hosea is probably the first chronologically to experience this kind of thing. And the first son is named Jezreel. The name Jezreel means God sows, and like sowing seed. But Hosea draws a connection with the bloodshed at the physical location of Jezreel. Jezreel was the place where the king Jehu began his dynasty in 2 Kings chapter 9 and 10. And what happens, he says, is that I will punish the house of Jehu for the bloodshed of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. Now, the question I always wondered about reading this and knowing the history of Jehu is, well, wait a second, is God just in doing this kind of thing? Because if you know the history of Jehu, and I don't know, Jehu's not a very well-studied Bible character, but if you know what happened, I'll just recap in summary. The house of Ahab was ruling over Israel at the time, and Jehu was appointed king. He was anointed by one of Elisha's servants with an express commission to go and exterminate the house of Ahab. Eliminate them. Treat them like the house of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, and Baasha. Jehu was tasked with eliminating Baal worship from Israel. And he does this by tricking everybody, and he tells everybody, Ahab served Baal a little bit, but I'm going to serve him a lot. He tricks everybody, he gets them into a big assembly building, and we're going to have a big Baal worship service. And then, of course, he instructs his men to kill everybody who's inside, and thus purging the worship of Baal from Israel. But Jezreel is the place it all started. Because at Jezreel was Ahab's son, Joram, and Joram's nephew, Ahaziah, who was also king of Judah, and Ahab's wife, Jezebel. And all three of them fell at Jezreel. In 2 Kings chapter 9, we learn that this was the command that God gave to Jehu. In verses 7 through 10, "You shall strike the house of Ahab, your master, that I may avenge the blood of my servants the prophets, and the blood of all the servants of the Lord at the hand of Jezebel. For the whole house of Ahab shall perish. I will cut off from Ahab every male person, both bond and free in Israel. I will make the house of Ahab like the house of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, like the house of Baasha the son of Ahijah. The dogs shall eat Jezebel in the territory of Jezreel, and none shall bury her." He opened the door and fled. Not a good thing to have happen to you. That's an understatement. And Jehu goes and he does exactly what God commands him to do. And at the end of the story, in 2 Kings chapter 10, in verses 30 and 31, in verse 30, the Lord said to Jehu, "Because you have done well in executing what is right in my eyes, and have done to the house of Ahab according to all that was in my heart, your sons of the 4th generation shall sit on the throne of Israel." You are guaranteed to have a dynasty that lasts at least 4 generations. And so we think, well, wait a second. Jehu's bloodshed at Jezreel was according to the command of God. Wasn't it what God told him to do? So why is he being punished for it now? Read the next verse. The same text, verse 31. "Jehu was not careful to walk in the law of the Lord, the God of Israel, with all his heart. He did not depart from the sins of Jeroboam, which he made Israel sin." This indicates that Jehu's motives were not pure. Jehu's real determination is not, "I'm going to do what God says because I am an obedient servant." No, that's not Jehu's disposition towards this. Otherwise, he wouldn't have kept worshiping the golden calves. But as it happens, he continued to follow in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat by worshiping the golden cows and by offering sacrifices to them. And so his reign winds up being limited to those 4 generations. Jehu has a son, Jehoahaz, that's one. Jehoash is his second son. And then Jeroboam the second is the great-grandson. And then Zechariah is the 4th, and Zechariah is dead within 6 months. And after that, it's a downward spiral for Israel. A bunch of rulers assassinating each other and killing each other until the Assyrians finally come in and finish them off. And so we see this kind of thing happening throughout all Scripture. God using wicked nations to punish another wicked nation. We think of Isaiah 10, wherever he calls Assyria the rod of his anger, the rod of discipline for Israel. But once he has finished his work, he says Assyria was rather proud within himself. Assyria boasted and claimed that this was my hand that did all these things. This was my power that accomplished all these things. Assyria, when they punished Israel, was not interested in doing God's will and accomplishing God's will. They were not interested in, obedience and things like that. They were interested in self-glorification. And so when God is done using Assyria to judge Israel, he uses another nation to judge Assyria and to destroy them. It's the same thing with Babylon. God used the Babylonians to destroy Jerusalem, but in Jeremiah 50 and verse 28 and in Jeremiah 51 and verse 11, God said he would avenge his house on the Babylonians because they destroyed it. It's the same thing with Jehu. God used Jehu to destroy the house of Ahab, but now Jehu will be punished for the bloodshed of Jezreel because he did not do this just to fulfill God's will. He was never really committed to God in the first place. He breaks the bow in the valley of Jezreel. One of the many subtle allusions here, the bow was Jehu's weapon of choice whenever he was out killing Jehoram and Ahaziah. And similarly, there's another story that involves a bow in 2 Kings chapter 13. Whenever Jehu's grandson, Jehoash, comes to Elisha, and Elisha is on his deathbed, and they're getting beat pretty badly by the Arameans up in the north. And Elisha tells him to take a bow and to shoot arrows at the ground. And he says, this is the Lord's arrow of victory over the Arameans. And Jehoash fires about 3 arrows, and then he stops. And Elisha kind of chides him for that. He says, Why do you only fire 3? You should have fired 4 or 5 or 6. At this point, you're only going to win 3 victories over the Arameans. You could have won 5 or 6 and utterly destroyed them. And so what happened in 2 Kings 13 and 14 is that God used Jehoash to win victories over their enemies. And God used Jeroboam II, his son, to win victories over their enemies. In fact, it says, by the words of another prophet who many people, if you've ever been in a children's Bible class, you're familiar with the words of Jonah. Jonah's prophecies are not limited to just what he wrote in the book of Jonah. There's another passage that is recorded only in 2 Kings chapter 14. We learn about Jeroboam in verse 25. It says that he restored the border of Israel from the entrance of Hamath as far as the Sea of Arabah, according to the word of the Lord, the God of Israel, which he spoke through his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai, the prophet who was of Gath-hepher. For the Lord saw the affliction of Israel, which was very bitter, for there was neither bond nor free, nor was there any helper for Israel. The Lord did not say that he would blot out the name of Israel from under heaven, but he saved them by the hand of Jeroboam, the son of Joash. And so God has been saving Israel even through these unrighteous kings of the house of Jehu. He has used Jeroboam II. Jeroboam II was a very successful king by worldly standards. The Bible gives so little actual information about him historically. But during his time, he restored the borders of Israel. It was almost like the days of David and Solomon again. But prophets like Hosea and Amos come on the scene and they say, don't be fooled. Don't be fooled by the prosperity that's going on. Less than 50 years from the time Jeroboam dies, the nation of Israel is no more. They've been sacked by the Assyrians. The city of Samaria has been destroyed. Why is that? Don't be fooled by the prosperity, he says. I'm going to break the bow. I'm going to break their military might. I'm going to break everything that has made them what they are because of the way they have treated me. In verse 6 of Hosea 1, a second child is born, Lo Ruhamah. That's a Hebrew name that means no compassion. He says, name her no compassion, because I will no longer have compassion on the house of Israel. Hosea is really fond of doing this wordplay thing, and sometimes it's lost in English translation. But name her no compassion, because I'm not going to have compassion on you anymore. Well, compassion is an attribute of God. A particular interest is what it says about the house of Jehu, again in 2 Kings chapter 13, in verse 23. Whenever Israel is about to be consumed by Hazael, the king of Aram, in verse 22, Hazael, king of Aram, had oppressed Israel all the days of Jehoahaz, that's Jehu's son, by the way, but the Lord was gracious to them and had compassion on them and turned to them because of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and would not destroy them or cast them from his presence until now. There, you see that God had compassion on Israel during that time. He tried to help them. He tried to give them a chance to repent. But what happens? No more, God says. I will no longer have compassion on the house of Israel. They have had enough. They have had enough chances to repent. They've had enough chances to get it right. Now God draws the line here and now and says, this is the end. But I will have compassion, he says in verse 7, on the house of Judah, and deliver them by the Lord their God, and will not deliver them by bow, sword, battle, horses, or horsemen. He will not use military might to save Judah. He will save them personally. The third child is born in verse 8. It says, after she had weaned Lo Ruhamah, she conceived and gave birth to a son. The Lord said, name him Lo Ami, for you are not my people and I am not your God. And Lo Ami is a Hebrew word that means not my people. Name your child not my people because you are not my people, he says. This happens after she weans Lo Ruhamah, and ancient people aren't like us. They wean children at like 2 or 3 years of age. So just keep that in mind, that this text is actually describing events that take place over a matter of years, condensed into 9 verses to describe what's going on. Israel is no longer the people of God, he says. You are not my people, I am not your God. Now, if any Israelite who was familiar with the promises of God would remember what God said to them in Exodus chapter 6. Say therefore to the sons of Israel, I am the Lord. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will deliver you from their bondage. I will also redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. Then I will take you for my people, and I will be your God. And you shall know that I am the Lord your God who brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. From the very beginning, God told Israel, I will be your God. You will be my people. This is a special covenant relationship. In Leviticus chapter 26, in verse 12, we have the same thing. I will dwell in them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And Jeremiah uses this expression all over the place. Go look it up sometime. And Ezekiel uses this expression all over the place. And it's even quoted twice in the New Testament. God says that we are His people and He is our God. But here God says, not my people. Lo ami. That's the horror of this whole thing. Why does God use harlotry, prostitution to describe this relationship? Why does God use these children with these symbolic names to talk about this relationship between Himself and Israel? Why go through such graphic descriptions of what's going on? It's very simple. This is what your sin does to him. I can't imagine what the horror what it would be like, to have an unfaithful spouse, the horror of that kind of thing. But God knows exactly what it's like. God knows quite a bit what that's like because that's who we are. That's where we stand before Him. Sometimes I will hear sin defined blithely as a transgression of God's law. And I'm not saying that's a false definition. That's a true definition. Sin is a violation of His law. But when we define it in those terms and just walk away, I think we miss sort of what God has to say on the matter. Everything God has to say on the matter. This is what your sin is to me, He says. It's prostitution. It's adultery. You're supposed to be faithful to me, He says. We're supposed to love each other. And look what you've gone and done. In verses 2 through 13 of chapter 2, and I'll just read this real quick. He says to the children, contend with your mother. Contend. She is not my wife. I am not her husband. Let her put away her harlotry from her face and her adultery from between her breasts. Or I will strip her naked and expose her as on the day when she was born. I will make her like a wilderness, make her like desert land, and slay her with thirst. I will have no compassion on her children because they are children of harlotry. For their mother has played the harlot. She who conceived them has acted shamefully. She said, I will go after my lovers who gave me my bread and my water, my wool and my flax, my oil and my drink. Well, were her lovers really giving her all that stuff? No. Therefore I will hedge up her way with thorns. I will build a wall against her so that she cannot find her paths. She will pursue her lovers, but she will not overtake them. She will seek them, but will not find them. And she will say, I will go back to my first husband, for it was better for me than now. For she does not know that it was I who gave her the grain, the new wine, and the oil, and lavished on her silver and gold, which they used for Baal. Picture that for a second. Husband gives gifts to his wife, and his wife turns around and gives them to other lovers, other men who she's having an affair with. That's what our sin is. That is what our relationship with God is like when we sin against Him. That is what the idolatry of our hearts. And you may not have a statue in your house that you're bowing down and praying to and burning incense to. But do we have idols in our hearts? Do we have things in our life that are taking priority over what God would have us be? Indeed, what is this? What hope is there? Well, I've been skipping around what it says in verse 10 of chapter 1. Because there's an abrupt shift in what God is saying to them. He says the number of the sons of Israel will be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. And in the place where it is said to them, you are not my people, it will be said to them, you are the sons of the living God. The sons of Judah and the sons of Israel will be gathered together, and they will appoint for themselves one leader, and they will go up from the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel. Say to your brothers, Ami, and your sisters, say to your sisters, Ruchama. The lows have been dropped. Don't normally tell people much about Hebrew from the pulpit, but the word lo means no or not. So it's a particle of negation. So there's the language lesson for the day. But Ami means my people, and Ruchama means compassion. reverses it. You see how he does that? The sons of Israel will be like the sand of the sea. Now, again, any Israelite would have been familiar with the promises to Abraham. Your descendants will be like the stars of the heaven and like the sand of the seashore. God is promising a kind of a restoration there. And in the place where it is said to them, you are not my people, it will be said to them, you are the sons of the living God. God will readopt them for His children and bring them back to Himself. He says that the sons of Judah and the sons of Israel will be gathered together, a reversal of the divided kingdom. They will appoint for themselves one leader. Jesus makes a veiled reference to this in John chapter 10 when He talks about other sheep who are not of this fold, who He goes and gathers for Himself, and they will become one flock with one shepherd. And I think the ultimate fulfillment of this leader that Hosea envisions is Jesus Himself. And this is all so similar to another statement later on in Hosea 2 in verse 23. Wherever God says, I will sow her for myself in the land. I will also have compassion on her who have not obtained compassion. I will say to those who are not my people, you are my people. And they will say, you are my God. Hosea 2 and verse 23. That's the story of our relationship with God. That's Israel's relationship with God. That is the relationship of the Gentiles with God. That is our relationship with God. Paul quotes this in Romans chapter 9 and verses 25 and 26. Well, back up, verses 23 and 24. He did this to make known the riches of His glory upon vessels of mercy, which He prepared beforehand for glory, even us whom He called, not from among Jews only, but also from among Gentiles. As He says also in Hosea, I will call those who were not my people, and her who was not beloved, beloved. And it shall be that in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they shall be called sons of the living God. In 1 Peter chapter 2, in verses 9 and 10, Peter also alludes to Hosea's concepts. When he says, you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of Him who has called you out of darkness into His marvelous light. For you once were not a people, but now you are the people of God. You had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. This is the bringing together of what was once broken. And yes, Hosea talks about it in terms of bringing back the divided kingdom together. A restoration to God. But there's a bigger restoration that needs to take place too. If there's a central claim in the Old Testament, it's that God is not merely a God of the Hebrews. He's the God of the whole world, who created the whole world, and all the nations of the world ultimately owe their existence to God. And so in that sense, those nations that have been scattered since Babylon must be regathered and restored to God all together. And so I do think it is appropriate to see the reuniting of the divided kingdom as typological of a reuniting of Jews and Gentiles together into one people of God, and indeed a reuniting of all people together at the end as one people of God who stand before Him in His throne in glory. Why does Hosea use these relationships in this way? The two most intimate of all human relationships are that of a husband and a wife, and that of a parent and a child. And Hosea weaves them together in such a way to show that we have both of them are analogous to our relationship with God. And when we sin, it is like a wife committing adultery on her husband. It is like a child rebelling against his parents. Hosea 11 describes this as well. When Israel was a youth, I loved him. Out of Egypt I called my son. But what happens? The more I called him, the more he ran from me. What kind of a tragedy is that? What kind of a horror is that for a parent to go through? Seeing their child run from them, wanting no part of them, wanting no further relationship with them. That is what our sin is to God. This image is all over the Old Testament, and I won't go through all those references because we're just strapped for time at this point. But there are two passages in the New Testament I want to point to. First is in Ephesians chapter 5. The relationship of a husband and wife is just as analogous to that of Christ and the church. It says that, verse 22, "Wives, be subject to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ also is the head of the church, he himself being the Savior of the body. But as the church is subject to Christ, so also the wives ought to be subject to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her, so that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present to himself the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she would be holy and blameless. So husbands ought also to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ also does the church, because we are members of his body. For this reason a man shall leave father and mother, and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is great, but I am speaking with reference to Christ and the church. Nevertheless, each individual among you also is to love his own wife, even as himself, and the wife must see to it that she respects her husband." How can a spiritual harlot be restored to God? How can a spiritual harlot become the bride of Christ? It says that he loved her and gave himself up for her so that he what? So that he might sanctify her, so that he might make her holy, cleansing her with the washing of water and the word. There is something that allows us to stand before God and be cleansed of our sins, and it is the blood of Jesus Christ. It is the answer to the dilemma that Hosea poses of how this Israel can become that Israel. It is the answer to the dilemma of harlotry that so pervades the life of every person who has defied God. It's the cleansing blood of Christ. A great marriage and a great relationship that will be consummated as it's described in Revelation chapter 21. He says in Revelation 21, beginning in verse 1, "I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride, adorned for her husband. I heard a loud voice from the throne, saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is among men. He will dwell among them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be among them. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will no longer be any death. There will no longer be any mourning or crying or pain. The first things have passed away. And he who sits on the throne says, Behold, I am making all things new. He said, Write, for these words are faithful and true. Then he said to me, It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. I will give to the one who thirsts from the spring of the water of life without cost. He who overcomes will inherit these things, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. But for the cowardly and unbelieving and abominable and murderers and immoral persons and sorcerers and idolaters and all liars, their part will be in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. And then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls full of the seven last plagues came and spoke with me, saying, Come here, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. Now that has application for each and every one of us today. Our human relationships need to be a reflection of the ideal of what our relationship with God should be. But in the same way, our relationship with God needs to reflect those human ideals. Those ideals of those relationships that God has for us. We must love God the way that a wife should love her husband. We must love God the way that children should love their fathers. And then we are faithful to him if we accept the cleansing power of his blood. Someday we will all stand before him, presented in glory as the bride of the Lamb, without spot, without blemish, without shame. If there's anyone here this morning that has not submitted their life to Christ, that has not been washed in the blood of the Lamb, or has turned and been unfaithful to the Lord once again, he offers the cleansing power and forgiveness. If there's anything we can do for you this morning to make it right, let it be known while we stand and while we sing.